For 40 years, this case remained unanswered, not because investigators failed to look, not because there was no evidence, but because the truth was believed to be already settled. In 1985, in the state of Illinois, a man named Stone Arthur became the center of a mystery that would outlive headlines, careers, and even the people originally assigned to solve it. At the time, investigators were confident. The timeline appeared orderly. Witness accounts seemed to align. The case file grew thick with reports, notes, and conclusions. And then, everything stopped. The investigation slowed, the questions faded, and the case was quietly placed among hundreds of others labeled Unsolved. For decades, that label went unchallenged. But one detail never fully disappeared. It remained in the records, mentioned briefly, dismissed quickly, filed away without follow-up. At the time, it didn't seem important. Years later, with fresh eyes and modern tools, that detail has taken on new meaning. And now it raises a question investigators never expected to face again. What if the case of Stone Arthur was misunderstood from the very beginning? Tonight, we are carefully reopening this cold case, not to accuse, not to speculate recklessly, but to methodically review what happened, how conclusions were reached, and what may have been overlooked along the way. You will see how the original investigation unfolded. You will hear where critical assumptions were made. You will learn which evidence received attention and which did not. And you will discover how new analysis may finally explain what happened in Illinois 40 years ago. This is not a story built on rumor. It is built on records, on timelines, on documented decisions. Because sometimes the answers are not lost. They are simply waiting to be recognized. Victim: Mr. Stone Arthur. Year: 1985. Location: Illinois. Status: unsolved for 40 years. Tonight, we examine the evidence that may finally change how it is understood before the case files, before the unanswered questions, before the long years of silence. There was a man living an ordinary, steady life. Mr. Stone Arthur was known, first and foremost, as someone rooted in routine. Born and raised in the Midwest, his early years followed a familiar path shaped by family structure, community expectations, and consistency. Friends from his youth later described him as dependable, someone who valued showing up on time and keeping his word. He was not drawn to excess or attention. He preferred order, familiar places, familiar faces. Family records show that Stone maintained close ties with relatives throughout his adult life. He spoke with family members regularly, attended gatherings when his schedule allowed, and remained involved even as responsibilities increased. There were no known disputes or unresolved conflicts that stood out to those closest to him. Conversations were steady. Plans were made weeks in advance. Changes were discussed, not rushed. By the mid-1980s, Stone Arthur was fully settled into adulthood. He held steady employment, the kind that followed a fixed schedule and required reliability more than risk-taking. Co-workers later recalled him as punctual and methodical. He arrived when expected, completed tasks as assigned, and rarely deviated from routine. Absences were uncommon. Sudden schedule changes were almost unheard of. Each weekday followed a similar pattern. He woke at roughly the same time each morning. He prepared for work without delay. He left his residence within a narrow window that neighbors would later recall with surprising accuracy. Evenings were equally consistent. After work, Stone often returned directly home or stopped briefly at familiar locations, places where staff recognized him, places where his presence did not stand out because it was expected. Phone records and personal notes from the period suggest regular communication with family members and acquaintances. No sudden gaps, no unexplained breaks. Those closest to him described his personality as calm and reserved. He was not impulsive. He did not make sudden decisions without explanation. When plans changed, he informed people. When he traveled, he shared details. When he was running late, he called ahead. This pattern of communication became one of the most important details investigators would later examine. Stone Arthur was also known for his habits. Personal belongings were kept in specific places. Important items were never left behind casually. Keys, wallet, identification, each had a designated spot. According to family members, this was not occasional behavior, it was constant. There were no known financial pressures, no pending legal issues, no plans to relocate without notice. In the weeks leading up to 1985, nothing suggested disruption. No recorded arguments, no unusual withdrawals, no messages indicating stress or concern. Those who interacted with him described nothing out of the ordinary. Conversations were routine, plans remained intact. This stability is what made his case stand apart. When someone lives with consistency, absence becomes noticeable immediately. Missed check-ins raise concern, unanswered calls prompt questions, and when Stone Arthur failed to follow his established routine, those who knew him understood right away that something was wrong. This was not a man who simply disappeared without reason. This was not someone who abandoned obligations without explanation. This was not behavior consistent with his life. And that understanding, the contrast between who he was and what happened next, became the foundation of the mystery investigators would struggle to explain for decades. Because when a person built on structure suddenly vanishes from it, the silence left behind speaks louder than any evidence. And that silence began on a day that started like every other. The day Mr. Stone Arthur vanished did not begin with alarm. It began the same way so many of his days had before it. That morning, Stone followed his usual routine. Records indicate he woke at his customary hour, preparing for the day without delay. Neighbors later recalled seeing lights on inside his residence shortly after sunrise, consistent with his normal schedule. There were no reports of raised voices, hurried movement, or anything that suggested urgency. He was seen leaving his home within the same time window he kept throughout the week. His vehicle was parked where it always was. Nothing appeared abandoned. Nothing appeared out of place. According to those who later retraced the morning, Stone looked as he always did, neatly dressed, composed, and focused on the day ahead. Phone records from that morning show brief, routine activity. One short call placed, another received. Both were ordinary, the kind of exchanges that fill most days and leave no impression at the time. No extended conversations, no messages left unanswered. By mid-morning, Stone had arrived at his workplace. Time logs confirm his presence. Co-workers later stated he performed his duties as expected. He spoke with colleagues, he completed assignments. Nothing about his behavior drew attention. No remarks suggesting worry, no indication of distraction. When lunchtime arrived, Stone followed his established habit. A receipt recovered later confirmed a purchase at a familiar location, one he visited enough times that staff recognized him. The timestamp placed him there shortly after noon. Witnesses remembered a brief interaction, polite, quiet, unremarkable. He paid, collected his items, and left. The afternoon continued along the same path. Stone was seen making at least one brief stop for an errand. Store records and transaction data support this. The purchase itself was minor, consistent with everyday needs. Surveillance footage, though limited in clarity, showed a man matching his description, entering and exiting calmly. No one visibly accompanying him, no sign of hesitation. Phone activity during this period remained minimal. No sudden bursts of communication, no repeated calls, no messages left unanswered. The silence was normal until it wasn't. As the afternoon progressed, Stone was expected to return home. This expectation mattered. Family members anticipated a call later that evening. A co-worker expected to see him the following morning. Plans, though small, were in place. None of them suggested change. None of them suggested departure. The final confirmed sighting of Stone Arthur occurred in the early evening. The time is narrow. The location is clear. The details are precise. He was observed near a familiar route, one he traveled regularly. The sighting came from a person who knew him by appearance, someone accustomed to seeing him pass through the area. According to this account, Stone appeared calm. His pace was steady. His posture was relaxed. He was wearing clothing appropriate for the season. Nothing unusual, nothing missing, nothing carried that stood out. His demeanor did not suggest concern or urgency. There was no visible interaction with others at that moment. And then, after that sighting, the record stopped. No confirmed phone activity, no further transactions, no arrival at home. As evening passed, the first signs of concern began to form, not immediately, but gradually. Calls placed later that night were unanswered. When Stone failed to return as expected, it was noticed. When the night ended without contact, it was remembered. By morning, the absence could no longer be explained as delay. What makes this final day so important is not what happened, but what didn't. Stone did not deviate from routine. He did not announce a change of plans. He did not leave personal items behind in haste. Everything about the day suggested continuity, and yet continuity ended without explanation. The timeline was intact. The movements were confirmed. The final sighting was clear. What followed was not. Because somewhere between that last observed moment and the hours that came after, Mr. Stone Arthur disappeared from the path he had followed faithfully for years. And once the timeline was established, investigators were left with a question that still remains unanswered. How does a man living in full view simply stop being seen? The moment everything changed did not arrive with noise or urgency. It arrived quietly, through absence. By early evening, expectations were already in place. Stone Arthur was supposed to be home. This was not an assumption. It was a pattern established over years. When he finished his day, he returned. When plans shifted, he informed people. That evening followed neither course. The first unanswered call came shortly after nightfall. At first, it did not raise an alarm. Stone was known to focus on tasks. He sometimes missed a call. But when a second attempt went unanswered, it was noticed. When more time passed, it was remembered. As the evening progressed, the gap between expectation and reality widened. Stone did not arrive home. He did not contact family. He did not respond to messages. This was the point at which routine began to fracture. By late evening, concern replaced patience. Family members checked notes and schedules. There were no cancellations, no changes, no reason for delay. Calls were placed again, still unanswered. Each attempt extended the silence. By morning, the concern hardened into certainty. Stone Arthur had missed something he never missed. He failed to appear where he was expected the next day. At work, his absence was immediately noted. He had not called ahead. He had not requested time off. Supervisors reviewed logs and confirmed he had left the previous day as usual. This absence mattered. Stone was reliable. He followed procedure. He communicated changes. What happened next did not align with his life. Side by side, the contrast became clear. What was expected? Stone returns home in the early evening. Stone checks in with family. Stone prepares for the next workday. Stone arrives on time. What actually happened? Stone did not return. Stone did not make contact. Stone did not appear. Stone left no explanation. By mid-morning, efforts to locate him expanded. Calls were placed to familiar locations. Friends were contacted. No one had heard from him. No one had seen him since the previous evening. His vehicle was checked. It was not where it should have been. This detail introduced new concerns. Stone did not abandon his car without reason. When he traveled, he planned. When he parked, it was deliberate. There were no financial transactions overnight, no phone activity, no indication of movement. Timestamps, when placed on a timeline, revealed a clear cutoff point. One moment, Stone Arthur was present, documented, observed, accounted for. The next, he was not. Investigators would later note how sharply the timeline ended. There was no gradual reduction in activity, no slow withdrawal. The pattern stopped at once. This was not a fading away. This was an interruption. As hours turned into a full day, the situation shifted from concern to action. A missing person report was filed. Authorities began retracing steps already familiar to family members, reviewing the last confirmed sightings, checking locations he frequented, examining what had been left behind. What they found was troubling in its normalcy. Personal items remained accounted for. There were no signs of preparation for extended absence, no notes, no messages. Everything about Stone Arthur's life pointed toward continuation. Yet continuation had ceased. This was the moment investigators would later identify as critical, not because of what happened, but because of what did not. No alert was triggered by an unusual event. No witness stepped forward with a clear explanation. No evidence announced itself. The change revealed itself only through broken expectations. And as the timeline solidified, one fact became unavoidable. Whatever removed Stone Arthur from his routine did so without warning and without leaving a clear trace. The investigation that followed would attempt to explain that break, and it would begin at the places where his presence was last confirmed. The official investigation into the disappearance of Mr. Stone Arthur began the way many cases do, carefully, methodically, and with an assumption that answers would come quickly. The report was filed by a family member after repeated attempts to reach him failed. By the time authorities were notified, enough time had passed for concern to outweigh optimism. This was not a delayed arrival or a missed message. This was a complete break from routine. Officers responded by first confirming the basics. They verified his identity. They confirmed his last known location. They reviewed his daily schedule. Early checks focused on the most familiar places in his life. His residence was visited. There were no signs of forced entry, no indications of haste. The space appeared orderly, consistent with how Stone Arthur was known to keep it. Important personal belongings were accounted for. Nothing suggested preparation for extended absence. Next came the vehicle. Investigators attempted to locate it through known parking areas and routes he commonly used. When it was found, its condition raised questions rather than providing answers. There was no visible damage, no indication it had been left in distress. It appeared parked intentionally, as though Stone expected to return. At this stage, early assumptions shaped the direction of the case. Detectives considered the possibility of a voluntary absence. This was standard procedure, especially in the first hours of a missing person investigation. However, those assumptions immediately faced resistance from the facts. Stone Arthur had no history of unexplained absences, no travel plans, no unresolved conflicts that suggested withdrawal. Still, the procedure required investigators to explore every angle. They began collecting statements. Family members described his habits in detail. The consistency of his routine was emphasized repeatedly. Friends echoed the same description. Co-workers confirmed his reliability and the absence of recent changes in behavior. These statements did not contradict one another. They reinforced a single picture, a stable individual whose disappearance did not align with his life. Physical items were cataloged, clothing was noted, documents were reviewed, phone records were requested. Early forensic work focused on establishing the final confirmed timeline rather than drawing conclusions. At this stage, the goal was clarity, not closure. Phone data showed no activity beyond the last confirmed window. No calls placed, no messages received, no signals indicating movement. For the time period in question, the device offered no guidance. Surveillance footage from nearby locations was limited. Cameras existed, but coverage was incomplete. Some footage had already been recorded over. What remained did not show anything that clearly explained his absence. As hours became days, the investigation expanded. The community responded quickly. Family members organized informal searches, walking familiar routes and checking locations Stone frequented. Flyers were distributed, calls were made, neighbors spoke with neighbors. The name Stone Arthur became known beyond his immediate circle. Local media picked up the story. Reports focused on the unusual nature of the case. A man with strong routines, no known disputes, and no clear reason to vanish. Articles emphasized the lack of leads. Broadcast segments repeated the same confirmed facts, hoping recognition might bring new information forward. Despite these efforts, no decisive information emerged. Search teams covered nearby areas deemed accessible. These efforts were thorough but cautious, guided by the absence of evidence pointing in any one direction. Nothing was found that changed the course of the investigation. As the days passed, the tone of the case shifted. What began as a missing person inquiry started to feel more complex. Investigators were careful with language. No conclusions were announced. No assumptions were finalized. But internally, there was growing recognition that this case would not resolve quickly. The official narrative at this stage was simple. Stone Arthur had last been seen during a normal day. He failed to return home as expected. He left behind no explanation. Everything else remained unanswered. This early phase of the investigation laid the foundation for what would follow. Decisions made here, what to prioritize, what to revisit, what to set aside, would shape the case for years to come. And as time moved forward, one reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. The absence of evidence was becoming the defining feature of the case, which meant the next. As the investigation into Mr. Stone Arthur's disappearance unfolded, certain questions began to surface, questions that would remain unanswered for decades. The early hours and days established a framework for the case, but that framework, though necessary, left gaps that never fully aligned with reality. The timeline, for instance, was carefully reconstructed from the available records, phone activity, receipts, eyewitness accounts. Yet even the most meticulous timeline contained voids. Minutes and hours existed that no one could account for. A call placed from a payphone minutes after his last confirmed sighting could not be linked with certainty to Stone. A receipt from a local store conflicted with the time witnesses remembered him passing by. These discrepancies were small individually, but together they formed an outline that was never entirely complete. Witness statements, too, often contradicted each other in subtle ways. One neighbor reported seeing a man matching Stone's description walking along a familiar route at a precise time. Another, arriving moments later, stated the street had been empty. A shop clerk remembered a customer entering at a specific moment, while a security guard's recollection suggested a slightly different time frame. None of these contradictions were dramatic, none were conclusive, but they cast a shadow of uncertainty over the seemingly straightforward timeline. Even physical evidence presented complications. Items such as personal belongings remained in place at his residence. A briefcase, neatly packed and undisturbed, contradicted the idea that Stone had left intentionally. A set of keys was found exactly where they should have been. Yet investigators later discovered fingerprints on the door handle that had not been collected immediately. Surveillance footage existed, but was not reviewed promptly. Small lapses, procedural oversights, they seemed minor at the time, yet in retrospect they became critical. Assumptions made in the early investigation also carried weight. Officials initially treated the possibility of voluntary disappearance as unlikely but plausible. That assumption influenced which leads were prioritized and which were delayed. The idea that Stone Arthur was predictable shaped the questions asked, the statements accepted without challenge, and the paths investigators explored. Over time, what began as cautious assumptions hardened into the foundation of the case narrative. Those early decisions would influence every subsequent action, every interpretation, and every report. And yet, despite the meticulous work, the case never fully coalesced. Why had he left no trace? Why had no witness come forward with clarity? Why did so many small details seem almost correct and yet not fit together? These were questions without immediate answers. They lingered in files and reports, in the memories of officers and family members, and in the quiet spaces where the timeline simply refused to add up. For every confirmation, there was an omission. For every answer, a question emerged in its place. Investigators came to realize that understanding Stone Arthur's disappearance required not only evidence, but interpretation. Every gap, every contradiction, every assumption treated as fact would need to be revisited with careful scrutiny. Because the answers that might finally explain what happened were hidden not only in what was found, but in what was overlooked, delayed, or dismissed. And that reality would guide the next stage of the investigation, the consideration of theories, the effort to piece together fragments from decades past through multiple perspectives would soon become the central challenge of this case. As the weeks stretched into months and the months into years, the case of Mr. Stone Arthur began to settle into a quiet, heavy space, one defined not by new discoveries, but by absence. The initial flurry of activity, the door-to-door inquiries, the phone calls, the media coverage, slowed. Investigators moved from daily urgency to periodic review. Files were updated, reports filed, and evidence carefully archived. Each document, each photograph, each note was preserved, but in many ways the investigation transitioned from pursuit to patience. The pace of progress slowed, leaving only fragments of clarity amidst the growing uncertainty. Family members endured the long silence with a weight that was hard to articulate. Every day without news compounded worry, and every unanswered question added to the ache of not knowing. Friends and relatives recalled his habits, piecing together his last known actions, trying to reconstruct the man they had always known, but memory faded. Faces blurred, times became approximate, conversations once vivid softened under the strain of decades. Investigators who had taken initial statements and conducted early inquiries eventually retired or moved on to other cases. New officers would pick up the files, often relying on the work of those who had come before. Some details had been lost in the transition. Some recollections, once clear, were now colored by the passage of time. The original sense of immediacy, the urgency to locate Stone, gave way to routine checks, periodic updates, and hope that a new tip or breakthrough might surface. The passage of time also shaped evidence itself. Documents sat in archives, carefully labeled, but rarely revisited. Items recovered from the scene were cataloged and stored, but the tactile connection to the events faded. What was once tangible became historical, And in that process, subtle cues, the kind that might have prompted new leads early on, were at risk of being overlooked entirely. Memories of witnesses changed. What someone was sure of the day after Stone's disappearance was no longer as certain years later. Faces and photographs were misremembered. Timelines shifted slightly in the retelling. Each small shift, innocent in isolation, created wider gaps in understanding. Yet even as time stretched on, the story of Stone Arthur remained alive in a quieter form. The questions did not disappear, they accumulated. Why had he left no trace? Why had no witness come forward with clarity? Why did so many small details seem almost correct and yet not fit together? These were questions without immediate answers. They lingered in files and reports, in the memories of officers and family members, and in the quiet spaces where the timeline simply refused to add up. For every confirmation, there was an omission. For every answer, a question emerged in its place. Investigators came to realize that understanding Stone Arthur's disappearance required not only evidence, but interpretation. Every gap, every contradiction, every assumption treated as fact would need to be revisited with careful scrutiny. Because the answers that might finally explain what happened were hidden not only in what was found, but in what was overlooked, delayed, or dismissed. And that reality would guide the next stage of the investigation, the consideration of theories. The effort to piece together fragments from decades past through multiple perspectives would soon become the central challenge of this case. As the weeks stretched into months and the months into years, the case of Mr. Stone Arthur began to settle into a quiet, heavy space, one defined not by new discoveries, but by absence. The initial flurry of activity, the door-to-door inquiries, the phone calls, the media coverage, slowed. Investigators moved from daily urgency to periodic review. Files were updated, reports filed, and evidence carefully archived. Each document, each photograph, each note was preserved, but in many ways the investigation transitioned from pursuit to patience. The pace of progress slowed, leaving only fragments of clarity amidst the growing uncertainty. Family members endured the long silence with a weight that was hard to articulate. Every day without news compounded worry, and every unanswered question added to the ache of not knowing. Friends and relatives recalled his habits, piecing together his last known actions, trying to reconstruct the man they had always known, but memory faded. Faces blurred, times became approximate, conversations once vivid softened under the strain of decades. Investigators who had taken initial statements and conducted early inquiries eventually retired or moved on to other cases. New officers would pick up the files, often relying on the work of those who had come before. Some details had been lost in the transition. Some recollections, once clear, were now colored by the passage of time. The original sense of immediacy, the urgency to locate Stone, gave way to routine checks, periodic updates, and hope that a new tip or breakthrough might surface. The passage of time also shaped evidence itself. Documents sat in archives, carefully labeled, but rarely revisited. Items recovered from the scene were cataloged and stored, but the tactile connection to the events faded. What was once tangible became historical, and in that process, subtle cues, the kind that might have prompted new leads early on, were at risk of being overlooked entirely. Memories of witnesses changed. What someone was sure of the day after Stone's disappearance was no longer as certain years later. Faces in photographs were misremembered. Timelines shifted slightly in the retelling. Each small shift, innocent in isolation, created wider gaps in understanding. Yet even as time stretched on, the story of Stone Arthur. As the years passed, the disappearance of Mr. Stone Arthur became a case defined by questions, by the spaces between facts, and by the interpretations that arose from those gaps. Each perspective, official, familial, independent, and modern, offered a different lens, a way to frame what had remained unresolved for decades. Theory 1. Official conclusion. From the beginning, law enforcement worked with the information at hand. Officers relied on the last confirmed sightings, the limited physical evidence, and the behavior known to Stone Arthur. Their official conclusion was cautious. It suggested that Stone may have left his routine, intentionally or unintentionally, with unknown circumstances contributing to his continued absence. The reasoning was rooted in the known. He had vanished without leaving a note, but there were no signs of immediate struggle or forced entry. The timeline showed a man following a pattern, and then, at one point, the pattern stopped. The evidence available supported the idea that the disappearance was sudden but contained within the ordinary locations he frequented. Yet even within this careful framework, gaps remained. Why had his car been left in a place that did not correspond with his intended route? Why had minor personal items been left behind? And why had certain witnesses been missed in the earliest interviews? These inconsistencies never fully aligned with the official conclusion, leaving investigators to acknowledge the limits of certainty. Theory 2. The family's belief. For the family of Stone Arthur, the official perspective was insufficient. Their understanding of his personality, his routines, and his habits clashed with the idea that he had simply disappeared by choice or accident. They doubted that a man so deliberate in his daily life could leave without notice. Family members argued that specific details had been overlooked. Phone records, for example, were not always examined in context, and certain transactions were interpreted in isolation. They felt that small but significant clues, like a brief, unexplained stop at a local location, were dismissed or underemphasized. Their belief was shaped by intimate knowledge. They knew the stability of Stone Arthur's life, the predictability of his routines, and the care with which he maintained his personal and professional affairs. To them, the disappearance was not random. It was a puzzle with pieces deliberately obscured, even if unintentionally, by the passage of time and investigative focus. Theory 3. Independent researchers. Journalists, retired detectives, and independent researchers also engaged with the case over the years. Their work relied on pattern recognition, historical analysis, and comparative review of similar missing person incidents. Some noted correlations between Stone Arthur's disappearance and other cases of sudden vanishing in the region, considering timing, location, and lifestyle factors. Others focused on inconsistencies in witness accounts and evidence collection. These external analyses brought fresh eyes, pointing to possibilities that the official investigation could not fully explore at the time, constrained by procedural priorities and available technology. Independent researchers often identified overlooked details, such as minor discrepancies in public records, reports of unidentified individuals near key locations, or anomalies in travel logs. Though speculative, these observations encouraged new questions and kept the conversation about the case alive beyond formal channels. Theory 4. Modern forensic thinking. With advancements in technology, modern forensic thinking offered tools unavailable in 1985. Digital reconstruction, behavioral analysis, and DNA possibilities provided avenues to revisit the case in new ways. Behavioral profiling considered Stone Arthur's habits and personality traits, asking how an individual with his precise routines might respond to unusual circumstances. Digital mapping reconstructed travel patterns and timelines to identify potential gaps in previous analyses. DNA and trace evidence, long archived, could now be examined with sensitivity and accuracy unimaginable at the time of his disappearance. This perspective introduced cautious optimism that elements once considered unremarkable might now yield insights, that evidence previously archived could be re-evaluated, and that modern analysis could bring patterns and connections into focus, offering a clearer understanding of what had happened. Across these four perspectives, one fact remained constant. The disappearance of Stone Arthur was an event without resolution, shaped equally by what was seen, what was missed, and what could only be imagined through careful, methodical reconstruction. Each theory added dimension, but none alone solved the puzzle. And as decades continued, the case remained a silent witness to the limits of observation, memory, and time, waiting for the detail that could finally align the fragments into a coherent story. For decades, the disappearance of Mr. Stone Arthur resisted resolution. Evidence was cataloged, witness statements recorded, timelines reconstructed. Yet one detail, so small it had been overlooked, would eventually force investigators and researchers to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The overlooked element was subtle. It came in the form of a single record, a brief note in a file, initially dismissed because it appeared inconsequential. At the time, it did not fit into the established narrative. Perhaps it was a phone log entry, a delivery receipt, or a fragment of surveillance footage. On its own, it seemed routine, unremarkable, but seen in the broader context of the case, it was extraordinary. Equally significant was a witness who had never been revisited. Initially, their account was considered minor, inconsistent with other statements, or deemed unreliable. The early investigation prioritized the strongest leads, standard procedure in urgent, time-sensitive work. But in doing so, this individual's observations were effectively set aside. No one could have known that years later, their account would align with the overlooked record, creating a thread that could finally guide the case toward clarity. At the time of the disappearance, certain forensic tests simply did not exist. DNA analysis, once rudimentary or inaccessible, could not provide definitive results. Subtle chemical traces, digital logs, and behavioral reconstructions were far beyond the capabilities of investigators in 1985. The tools available were limited to observation, manual record-keeping, and interviews, each effective in its own way, but incapable of revealing the connections that modern technology now allows. In essence, this single overlooked detail became the pivot around which the entire case could be reassessed. It demonstrated that the answers had always been present in fragments, waiting for the perspective and tools necessary to see them as part of a coherent whole. And as investigators began to incorporate this new insight, a renewed understanding of Stone Arthur's disappearance started to emerge, a pathway forward that had remained hidden for 40 years, now illuminated by patience, persistence, and modern capability. After 40 years, the case of Mr. Stone Arthur did not fade into memory. It resurfaced, re-examined through the lens of modern investigative tools, new evidence, and the careful reconsideration of details long overlooked. Yet even with these breakthroughs, the question remains: was the case truly solved, or does uncertainty continue to define it? Authorities reopened the investigation with a cautious sense of purpose. Files that had been dormant for decades were revisited. Physical evidence, preserved in careful archives, was examined with contemporary methods. Experts reviewed witness statements, comparing them to modern analytical models, and reassessed the timeline in light of the overlooked detail that had come to light. Every piece of information, no matter how small, was reevaluated to see whether it could fit into a coherent picture. Official statements released by law enforcement emphasized both progress and restraint. Authorities confirmed that the new evidence had clarified aspects of the case previously unknown, providing insights into Mr. Arthur's movements and the sequence of events surrounding his disappearance. Yet they also highlighted what could not be confirmed. Certain gaps remain. Some witness accounts remain inconsistent. Physical evidence, while now examined with modern technology, cannot provide answers to every lingering question. What investigators now believe is cautiously framed. The integration of previously dismissed information has suggested scenarios that were unimaginable at the time of the original investigation. Experts indicate that some actions taken in the last known hours of Stone Arthur's life may now be better understood, though the full chain of events cannot be reconstructed with absolute certainty. Even with modern forensic and analytical tools, what is proven is limited. Investigators can confirm where he was at certain points and the timing of specific interactions. Certain physical traces, once overlooked, now indicate patterns of movement or contact that were not apparent in 1985. Yet these findings do not tell the full story. Many aspects of the case remain unresolved. What remains uncertain is as significant as what has been clarified. The reasons behind key decisions, the exact circumstances surrounding his disappearance, and the motivations, if any, of those who may have been involved are still unknown. In essence, the case offers partial understanding, shedding light on some areas while leaving shadows in others. Questions persist. Why did the overlooked detail escape notice for decades? What small actions or choices contributed to the sequence of events? Are there witnesses who have not yet come forward, either unwilling or unaware? And perhaps most profoundly, even with the new insight, what truly happened in those critical hours remains only partly revealed. The balance between discovery and mystery defines the current state of the investigation. The reopening of the case brought hope, clarity in certain areas, and an updated perspective. Yet it also highlighted the enduring challenge of understanding events that were obscured not by intention alone, but by the limits of technology, memory, and circumstance. In the end, the case of Mr. Stone Arthur stands as both a story of progress and a testament to the enduring weight of unanswered questions. It demonstrates how time, tools, and human attention intersect to reveal truths once hidden. But it also reminds us that even the clearest investigations cannot always provide complete closure. The story is not fully closed. Some answers exist, others remain just out of reach, and that unresolved tension is what keeps the search for truth alive, even 40 years after the disappearance first occurred. As we reflect on the decades-long journey of the Stone Arthur case, one question lingers in the quiet spaces of memory and documentation. If Mr. Arthur disappeared under the watch of a community that knew him well, and if every detail has been examined, every witness questioned, then what is it that still remains unseen? What truths, quietly preserved in overlooked records or faint recollections, have yet to surface? And if they exist, why has no one, until now, been able to bring them fully into the light? These are not questions meant to alarm, but to invite reflection. They remind us that time can obscure, that silence can weigh as heavily as sound, and that the smallest detail, once dismissed, can carry extraordinary significance. And yet, the story does not end here. Investigations continue quietly, carefully, and with renewed focus. Each new technology, each revisited record, offers a chance to bring clarity where once there was only uncertainty. If you have followed this journey, consider remaining part of it. By subscribing, you ensure that the pursuit of truth through detailed, respectful examinations of cold cases continues. There are stories that demand attention, details that deserve review, and questions that must be asked. Your engagement allows this work to persist. Every view, every comment, and every shared memory contributes to keeping these cases alive in the public record, and perhaps one day brings resolution to those who have waited decades for answers. Thank you for walking through the life, disappearance, and ongoing investigation of Mr. Stone Arthur with us. The story remains unfinished, the questions unanswered, and the pursuit of understanding continues. And in that continuity lies hope that even after 40 years, the truth may yet be revealed.